Hearing voices through the ages. People have been hearing voices for many thousands of years. Voice hearing dates to at least 10,000 BC. In early civilizations, people who heard voices were seen as individuals of spiritual significance. Hence, voice hearers held significant positions in early societies of the world. Julian Jaynes, an American psychologist at Princeton University in the USA, writes in his long and detailed 1977 book, The Origin of Consciousness in the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind, that the leaders of many early civilizations of the world were voice hearers. These voice hearers were seen by their subjects as being in direct communion with the gods or with God via their voice hearing experiences. Temples, monuments, murals, statues, figurines, and pyramids in Egypt and, for example, in Central and South America were built in tribute to this divinity of madness. The bicameral meaning consisting of two chambers, the bicameral kingdoms of the Egyptians, of the Hittites, of the Maya people, and of the Incas were grand tributes to the world of the supernatural and to the world of the divine. From Turkey to Peru, from Egypt to Mexico, from Cyprus to Central Asia, the leaders of these early civilizations were hallucinatory god kings. At the death of these spiritual figures, considerable preparations were made by their subjects to please their peers on their spiritual journey to the next world. After death, the hallucinatory god kings were regarded as gods. In other words, in early societies of the world, dating back to approximately 10,000 BC, voice hearing was seen as a divine phenomenon. The thesis of Julian Jaynes is that, in the words of James, some of the fundamental, most characteristic, and most commonly observed symptoms of florid and medicated schizophrenia are uniquely consistent with the bicameral mind. In a similar context to the bicameral kingdoms of Egypt, of Mesopotamia, of the Maya people, and of the Inca people, the heroes of the Iliad and the prophets of the Old Testament often heard the voices of gods or the voice of God. The Iliad tells the story of the Trojan Wars, a war caused by the most beautiful woman in the world, Helen. Helen left her husband and ran off to Troy with her lover Paris. Her husband pursued her with all the armies of Greece, and Homer wrote the Iliad about the war that followed. Homer frequently describes some Greek god or goddess appearing to a warrior in the middle of the Trojan War. The Greek god or goddess tells the warrior what to do. In other words, at a time of extreme circumstance or at a time of trauma, a god or goddess appears. According to Julian Jaynes, this type of phenomenon was not a metaphorical experience, but a real experience. Similarly, the experiences of the prophets of the Old Testament were not metaphorical experiences, but real experiences. The extraordinary aural and visual experiences of such prophets as Ezekiel, Isaiah, Job, and Amos were not literary phenomena, but were real experiences. If Ezekiel, Isaiah, Job, or Amos were alive in Europe in the 20th century, they would be regarded by psychiatry as being mentally ill. In the 1960 book, The Divided Self by R.D. Laing, one significant consultant psychiatrist refers to the prophet Ezekiel of the Old Testament as being a schizophrenic. Many of the prophets of the Old Testament were regarded by the majority of their contemporaries as aliens. The prophets of the Old Testament were not normal. In many ways they were outsiders, prepared at a crucial time to swim against the tide of what their contemporary society would regard as normality. The prophets of the Old Testament were misfits. They fitted badly into their contemporary society. In the 1920 edition of Peake's Commentary on the Bible, the founding stone on which academics build their interpretation of Christianity, Dr. G.C. Joyce, in an essay entitled Old Testament Prophecy, wrote the following about the prophets of the Old Testament. In all early societies, the abnormal mental states of vision and ecstasy were as profoundly impressive to the onlookers as they are to the man who experiences them. Both he and they are convinced that these mysteries are conclusive evidence of intercourse with the spiritual world. But now, Joyce writes in 1920, but now the general attitude towards the attendant circumstances of early inspiration has been completely reversed. The unstable psychic temperament, with its tendency to fall into trances, instead of arousing respect as of old, is the subject of suspicion. The fact that any claimant to inspiration was subject to trances and other mental disturbances would in many quarters today raise doubts as to his sanity, and would certainly weaken the force of his testimony. Great truths and great conceptions, having been elaborated in the lower and hidden strata of the mental life, suddenly emerge into consciousness. The process is certainly abnormal. Undoubtedly the prophets were abnormal. They were men of genius. They were visionaries. From their own spiritual experiences, they learned how divine truth is recognized in daily intercourse with the Spirit of God. Frequently, Joyce writes in 1920, frequently the prophet was forced by inspiration within him to place himself in direct opposition to the majority of his fellow countrymen. By his own generation, he was an alien. The use of the term alien to describe the prophets of the Old Testament is pertinent. In the early history of psychiatry in the Age of Reason, psychiatrists were known as alienists, and the mentally ill were known as aliens. Voice hearers after the time of the prophets of the Old Testament include Moses, Jesus, Muhammad, a number of saints of the early Celtic Church, Joan of Arc, Saint Teresa of Avila, and St. John of the Cross. According to M.A. Screech, the author of the 1997 book Laughter at the Foot of the Cross, published by Alan Lane, The Penguin Press, 1997, Jesus was regarded by most of his contemporaries as a madman, someone to be mocked and someone to be ridiculed. There have been other voice hearers of significance in the past 2,000 years. Saint Brynach of North Pembrokeshire was a 6th century saint of the Celtic Church. In his lifetime, he used to commune with angels on a mountainside in North Pembrokeshire. Saint Cuthbert, a 7th century saint of the early Christian Church, heard a voice or voices. Saint Cuthbert in his lifetime displayed certain aspects of self-neglect that often characterizes the behavior of the typical 20th century schizophrenic. Cuthbert did not use to wash, and he used to allow his fingernails to grow to excessive length. The saints of old used to refer to the gift of tears, and it could be said that many of the mentally ill have, in nervous breakdown, the gift of tears. St. Joan of Arc, as a result of hearing voices, led, as you know, a campaign in France against the English invader. As a result, Joan of Arc was burnt at the stake as a heretic by the English Church. St. Teresa of Avila and St. John of the Cross also had voice-hearing experiences, and their published work was the product of unusual and abnormal life events. My thesis, rightly or wrongly, is that since about 1750 in Europe, philosophy and science have gradually become more and more dominant in European society at the expense of institutional faith. Skepticism and cynicism have replaced institutional belief. In the middle of the 18th century, Voltaire's book, Candide, satirized in a simple and effective way the view of Leibniz, the traditional philosopher of the time, that tout va au mieux dans le meilleur des mondes possibles. Everything is for the best in the best of possible worlds. The publication of Candide symbolized the change in mood in Europe that in the next 250 years increasingly undermined common belief in the Protestant and Catholic churches. Voltaire and other philosophers of the Age of Reason insisted that, in the words of Nietzsche, the German philosopher, that God is dead. Philosophy, science, and psychiatry, supported by a social adoration of normality, marginalized voice-hearing into societal irrelevance. However, there have been and there are significant 20th century voice hearers. 20th century voice hearers include Carl Gustav Jung, Sir Winston Churchill, Sir Anthony Hopkins, and Zoe Wanamaker. Not all voice-hearing experiences are, as you know, pleasant experiences. According to Aidan Shingler, an artist who held an exhibition of his schizophrenic work at Durham Cathedral in August 1997, schizophrenia consists of a spiritual conflict. Schizophrenia appears to involve, as it were, often a giant battle between God and the devil. 20th century voice hearers labeled by psychiatry as schizophrenic include Louis Wain, the man who drew cats, John Ogden, the English classical pianist, Peter Green, the founder member of the blues band Fleetwood Mac, Syd Barrett, an ex-member of the band Pink Floyd, and Brian Wilson, singer-songwriter and leading force of the American band The Beach Boys. In 1975, Pink Floyd issued an LP entitled Wish You Were Here. The LP was dedicated to and was about Syd Barrett, a former key member of the band who was to become labelled by psychiatry as schizophrenic. The song which I shall play is the title track of the Pink Floyd LP Wish You Were Here. It is the first song in the history of popular music, I believe, that has as its theme a tribute to a schizophrenic.
So you think you can tell heaven from hell, blue skies from pain? Can you tell a green field or a cold steel rail, a smile through a veil? Do you think you can tell? Did they get you to train your heroes to go? Hot eyes and trees, hot air from the cool breeze, cold country chair. Did you exchange walk on part in the war, the lead role in a cage? How I wish you were here. We're just two lost souls swimming in a fishbowl, year after year, running over the same old ground. Have we found the same old fear? Wish you were here.
Voice hearing is not a particularly uncommon experience. According to recent research, 10 to 15% of people hear a voice or voices over a long period of time. 4 to 5% of individuals hear a voice or voices at any one moment in time. The impact of these voices fall into two types. Most people perceive the voice or the voices as helpful. The voices evoke a feeling of recognition. These people feel that the purpose of the voices is strengthening and raising their self-esteem. The voices are experienced as positive and as understandable and as an understandable aspect of their internal selves. Others, and they are a minority, experience the voices as aggressive and negative from the very beginning. For these people, the voices are hostile and are not accepted as part of themselves. They suffer from negative voices that can cause chaos in their minds, demanding so much attention that communication with the outside world is extremely difficult. However, in most circumstances, voice hearing is manageable. There are at least 2 million voice hearers in the UK. There are approximately 250,000 schizophrenics in the UK. People have been hearing voices for thousands of years, and according to Julian James, the American psychologist, voice hearers played a significant part in various societies of the world until about 1300 BC. Then, according to James, the bicameral mind broke down. However, since 1300 BC, there have been many significant voice hearers who were not often recognized in their own lifetime. R.D. Laing wrote in his 1967 book, The Politics of Experience, Penguin, 1990, that madness is the birth pains of a higher consciousness. David Cooper wrote in his 1993 introduction to Michel Foucault's book, Madness and Civilization, Routledge, 1993, that madness has become in our age some sort of lost truth. However, as we enter a new age at the approach of the new millennium, I believe that voice hearers will acquire in the next 100 years a greater significance than has been traditionally afforded to them in the Age of Reason. Interesting material has been published about voice hearing in the past 5 years. Paul Baker's book, The Voice Inside, A Practical Guide to Coping with Voices, Hansel Publications, 1995, available from Mind Publications, is an interesting and positive contribution to the issue of voice hearing. The book, Accepting Voices, edited by Professor Marius Rom and Sandra Escher, Mind, 1993, is an equally significant yet more detailed publication about the issue of voice hearing. Philip Thomas's 1997 book, The Didactics of Schizophrenia, Free Association Books, 1997, calls rightly for a more balanced discourse between voice hearers and psychiatry. For too long, I feel, psychiatry has equated all voice hearing with madness. In conclusion, voice hearing as a phenomenon of nature has been present amongst the human race for at least 12,000 years. For most of those 12,000 years, voice hearing has been interpreted by most of society, either immediately or eventually, as a phenomenon of sanctity or holiness, rather than as a phenomenon of madness or lunacy. Voice hearers have, I suggest, a spiritual and or religious significance, or the potential for such a significance. Most voice hearers have no contact with psychiatry whatsoever. It is a shame that, in the words of the 1996 Times Preacher of the Year, the Church gave the world of nature to science, and the Church gave its heart to psychiatry in the 20th century. However, with the introduction of community care, change is now in the air. One is gradually allowed to talk about voices. The pioneering work of Professor Marius Rom and Sandra Escher in Holland with voice hearers and with children who hear voices is significant and helpful. The 1995 book Conversations with God, an Uncommon Dialogue, written by an American voice hearer, Neil Donald Walsh, Hodder and Stoughton, 1995, is an international bestseller. It could be that stones, so readily rejected by society in the past 250 years, may become cornerstones of a new reality in the next 250 years. As the age of Pisces moves into the age of Aquarius, voice hearers may acquire, as writers, painters, musicians, sculptors, poets, and/or artists, a new perspective and a new significance. In this context, it could very well be that the least shall in fact become the most. My name is Hywel Davies. I am chair of Pembrokeshire Hearing Voices Group. It is October 1998. Thank you for listening.